all going to go horribly wrong. I've got too many things. I've got bits of paper, and I've got this thing I've got to press buttons. I've got a pair of glasses. Don't know what to do with those. So there it is. I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people, the traditional owners of these lands. I pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and support their ongoing resistance against colonisation. This presentation will contain some language, so consider yourselves warned. I live and work in the middle of that. It's a Brisbane suburb with creeks to the north and the south. Surrounded by timber, post-war, housing commission, and on the edge of flash 70s brick double garages. In some way, this image contains our home where we raised our child to adulthood. But it also contains the imprint of the house I grew up in, the church I attended as a boy, my old school, the first place I performed in front of people. Hello. I'm John Willsteed, and I've been a musician for some time, as illustrated by these photorealist images by Matt Mawson. Needing a job, I became an academic 20 years ago, and I had to embrace the concept of research. Two things became clear. I'm really interested in local cultural history, mainly because I'm part of it, and I love listening to people talk about themselves. I love listening to me the most. I felt very lucky 18 months ago when this fellowship was announced, and here's me looking lucky. The purpose of this project, Dive for Your Memory, which is named after the last song on side 2 of the Go-Betweens album 16 Lovers Lane, was to gather stories from Queensland musicians. In the proposal, I said I'd talk to maybe a dozen people, and then I'd make some little tiny documentaries or webcasts. And it all started like this. A little list of names, some on paper, some in my head, mostly people I know. After chatting with the Queensland Memory staff, that list expanded somewhat. I fought back and I whittled the list down, but still the dozen names had quadrupled. The green ones are the ones I've done. I got lucky with this list. Well, I got lucky and unlucky, and I was lucky because some people were returning to Queensland for Christmas last year or coming through on tour, so I managed to grab them without having to travel south. And I was unlucky because some, sadly, didn't even survive 2024. Ronnie Pino, Jeff Wilkes, and especially Mark Moffat were three whose loss is keenly felt. And therein lies one of the drivers for this project and projects like this that I've been involved with over the past dozen years. I was 68 last month, and an accelerating number of my generation of musicians are no longer here to tell their stories. So filming chats with these people was my job, editing to remove most of my off-camera blather, and then passing them into the State Library as an oral history collection. As a bit of value adding, I'm going to include film and audio interviews that I've conducted previously, both for my PhD and related research projects. So I bought a little kit and I started filming. I'm not very good at it. I graduated from film school in the 90s, specialising in sound, not vision, but I did my best. So here are 24 faces out of the 30 interviews conducted so far. The interviewing method was pretty simple, and here, Brad sums it up beautifully.
Just a couple of old buggers talking shit.
So, I warned them all beforehand. I don't do any research, and I only have one question. What's your name, and when and where were you born? I also warned them that about after an hour or so, really, I just stopped listening. And this list, most of these people were born here, but some came from up north or down south. Some came from across the seas. John came from Liverpool as a boy in the 60s and ended up in Acacia Ridge.
So we were on a street, and on the other side of the street was the bush. It was just called the bush. And at the bottom of the street was the hill. And then at the bottom of the hill was the creek. That was John Oxley Creek, but nobody called it by its name. And we would just run wild down there because there was no infrastructure for kids except for streetlights which were there to be smashed. That's what we thought, just throwing rocks at the streetlights. So every summer the creek would flood, and our parents, like most parents, went out to work, and we were just running around wild in these flooded creeks, and you know, I might have been 10 or 12, and then I would be in charge with younger kids. Never lost a kid, not on my watch. Shooting each other with slug guns. It's just, yeah, I don't think anybody died, but it's a surprise that they didn't.
This is a tale that is common across many of these histories.
Over the fence, there was this huge bushland. So me and my brothers would just, we would just walk off in the bush, and there was heaps of blue-tongued lizards, the bearded dragons or whatever. So we used to collect them and, made up a chicken wire fence in the backyard and kind of thought they were like little dinosaurs, and fed that kookaburras little chunks of fat from the steaks or whatever, It was a good childhood, I guess.
Now, as they grew into their various childhoods, some of these musicians could easily see the source of their musicality.
So my granddad used to play music as well. My dad played in workers' clubs. My granddad used to play, he had his own dance band, the Billy Pickvan's Dominant Dance Band. We've got pictures of it. Also, and he used to play in the silent movies as well, for the violin and, making the drama come real.
Adele came to Australia from north of Manchester when she was 15. It was a cold and damp world she came from. Less so was the Toowoomba where Helen Russell grew up, but there was just as much music in the spirals of her DNA.
My mother was a freaky good musician. Like, she was the person who, could play anything by ear in any key you wanted, and, was a very good classical pianist. Went off to Sydney because that was the only that was the closest conservatorium in her day. Being a classical piano player is quite a weird world, and she was already playing jazz and everything else, and I think it wasn't the place for her.
So some comes from the inside, but a musical education comes from outside. Parents, sisters, brothers, neighbours, teachers, record shops and magazines. In Kelly's case, her parents weren't that influential.
My dad loved the Beatles, but we didn't have a lot of Beatles records. I think my parents were very, very big on Neil Diamond and John Denver and like the Grease soundtrack.
Now, David's parents were possibly a bit groovier, but he actually had more luck with his neighbours.
And next door we had the Groves, and Chris Grove was my age, but his older brother Stephen and Lindsay, they older brothers, oh my God, the music they had. Yeah. I remember later on they were like, there's this band called Mental as Anything. And I was like, that is the best name I have ever heard. When you're 9 or 10, Mental as Anything, that's brilliant.
Inspiration also came wrapped in retail. In the late 1970s, the Elizabeth Arcade was a centre of counterculture in Brisbane, and in the arcade, hemmed in by the head shops, the boutique and the politics, Phil Smith and Mary McDonald set up discreet import records. Just like at Rocking Horse, those cross-counter conversations inspired a generation of music makers.
And I used to go into this discreet because I always wanted to get it 3 months before I could buy it locally. And then I started talking to Phil and Mary, and they just went, oh, well, then you should get that, and that. And I was like, oh, okay. I mean, they were absolutely instrumental in guiding me. I'd just buy it. I wouldn't have to hear it. I'd go, yeah, okay. And I just and they were always right.
So the influences get us in different ways, but the impact of particular experiences with music can be profound and transformative.
Songs that sort of stuck with me, as a really 5 or 6 year old, A Boy Named Sue by Johnny Cash. First song I ever heard that sort of described a grubby world, and sort of revelled in it, sort of mud, blood and beer, and this weird story about wanting to kill your father because you got a girl's name and all this. And it's the first song that I ever heard with something bleeped out.
So for Tex, this music opened a door to another world of images and ideas that took him out of the suburban swamp that was Boondall. For Rob, it lightened the stifling burden of childhood trauma.
I was going on a bus trip from Canberra to Sydney. We had this trip, it might have been just on the radio, I think it was a hit at the time, was ABBA's SOS. And I felt like I was totally enveloped in the sound, immersed, and in the emotion of it. It felt like this to me, that it was cathartic, and it was also a way to really feel the feelings but not get overwhelmed by them, and of sadness. But that music was so powerful for me, and I think that's when I got switched on to music, really.
And for Sam, probably the youngest person I spoke to, his guitar teacher was pivotal.
His name was Noel, a really influential character in my, journey of music. Him and Dad and I would just talk about music. We'd go through Dad's record collection. I'd pick a record with a song I wanted to learn. Noel would put it on. He'd work it out by ear, and then he'd teach me the song. And that's like how I learned guitar for years. Absolutely no theory whatsoever. Yeah. And also forming like a deep love of I guess just popular music and that whole world, digging through the records, putting them on, just falling in love more broadly with music. So in many ways I'm like, well, I credit him and Dad for kind of igniting the passion first and foremost, And
there was one story here which struck a chord with me. I asked Charlie if there was anyone who was a mentor or an influence on him as a musician. He was unequivocal.
It wasn't until Mark Simmons moved up here and I met him, he opened our eyes to how to play more freely, and he was a great conduit in between bands like Pork, mainstream jazz, abstract jazz. I mean, Mark was really one of the greatest jazz players Australia will ever see, and he played really with the top of the Sydney jazz players, but he could play any style. And he also had this desire to be the best. And he openly said, if you're going to do anything, be as fucking good as you can. And so he was an incredible musician to be living in Brisbane. And I don't think Brisbane jazz world knew what they had, really.
I met Mark Simmons in 1976 and we dabbled together in the 80s. He was a lovely, gentle, smart man who was sorely missed. And although he came from the south, I always identify him with those years he spent in Brisbane. The music itself, of course, is also a great evoker of time and place.
When we surfed at Kingscliff Beach, there was a surf club, Lifesavers, and they used to have big speakers. And they'd have the Gold Coast radio station. You're in the surf, you could hear the music. And I remember being in the surf and hearing the Master's Apprentices turn up your radio.
Now, although Peter isn't a Queenslander, him and his brother Jeremy spent many hours surfing and performing up and down the Northern Rivers and the Gold Coast, while Ben grew up in the Bayside suburbs.
Music has always had this really emotional attachment for me, and I've got many other songs that have the same feeling. Like every time I hear Don Henley's The Boys of Summer, I can almost smell the chlorine at the Cleveland pool, and you're standing in line and you can hear the sound of that song coming through those shitty horn speakers. But every time I hear The Boys of Summer, I'm at the Cleveland pool.
But loving songs and learning how to play them requires some skill acquisition, and then there's the question of performing.
On Monday nights, I have my guitar lesson. It's just something I have to do, I remember my parents would be like, Sam, calling me in off the street, time for your lesson, So I just did it. And I still have this vivid memory of there being an acoustic guitar in the classroom for some reason. And the teacher's like, can anyone play? And I was sort of like, oh, yeah, I've been learning, and played a little ditty. And I can still remember kids being like, holy shit, that's cool. We didn't know you could do this.
I must have been in year 5 or 6 and just set it up at the port rack, find a power thing and start playing chords, to people. Check this out. Down, 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 down. You can imagine it was atrocious, but it just I wanted to, share this noise with people.
Now, it's all very well wowing the grade sixes at the port rack, but getting out there as... have you heard anybody say port rack in like 50 years? No. Getting out there as young adults and playing in front of a paying audience is another thing. In December of 1979, my band Zero, that's Zero with a Z, not Zero with an X, because Zero with an X came later, moved into the old Smith and Patterson building in Kemp Place. We weren't the first band in, and nor the last. And a month or two later, we began playing shows at two nightclubs just around the corner, Romeo's and Pinocchio's. And it was because of this guy. John Reed was a writer, a band manager, a promoter and a performer. And when John died in 2016, his collection of papers and tapes, interviews were donated to the library, and they contained this fabulous letter. Addressed to the club owners, it was 3 pages of clear and concise reasoning as to why he should take over the management of Pinocchio's. Considering the reputation of your club as a dump, the decor is a surprise. I cannot imagine what Jerry and Tony Bellino, the owners of the club, thought of this. But he got away with it, and the Valley opened up to young bands playing original music.
In Brisbane in that period, although politically and culturally it seemed very repressed, and it was a hotbed of stuff going on really around then. Yeah. I could go to West End and see the Humans or the Leftovers. I could go to the Brisbane Jazz Club and play with the Barnard brothers, you know.
10 years later, the Valley was still groovy, although Pinocchio's and Romeo's had new names.
And then we started doing little gigs in Fortitude Valley at the Love Inn or the Outpost or something like that, just little Monday night residencies and stuff. And we thought we'd made it, Johnny. We thought we'd absolutely made it. Monday night, we're playing at the Outpost, $2 to get in.
Oh, that's a big deal.
Yeah, it was. And you'd lug all the gear in, you know, everyone would borrow their parents' car, and everything was so big back then.
Adele also remembers the Valley in the late 80s with fondness, but from a slightly different perspective.
Come on, it's the safest part of Brisbane you could ever be in. You know, it's just full of gays, you know, drug dealers and pimps. I mean, they're completely safe. It's not full of people wanting to bash people up on kind of meth and guys just taking their shirts off and being animals. It was quite an okay place.
Yeah. As these familiar haunts went through changes, so the underpinning of the music industry was being dramatically altered. It was a tale oft told in the last half of the 20th century that anyone who wanted to succeed at their craft needed to leave Queensland, to head south, or more impressively to the international terminal at the airport for goodbye drinks. But by the 1990s, bands began to entertain the idea of staying put.
We were like, no, we're not going to move.
What's that about?
I don't know. Moving to Sydney or Melbourne just didn't seem to hold any appeal. It was great to go there, to do gigs and see other things, but we wanted to be a Brisbane band. I reckon it's because Sydney and Melbourne, we had, you know, put Brisbane down so much, we had a little chip on our shoulder like, well, fuck you, we're not going to move to Sydney or Melbourne. Yeah. And we put an EP out called Brisbane. Like, we just wanted to be, we felt like sort of rednecks from the deep north, and that's what we wanted to be. And we were hanging out with Bob Moore and Glenn Thompson, and they all had that sort of Queensland, you know, fuck you, we're from Queensland.
Now, before we all say our good nights, me and my two-dimensional buddies, I'd like to make a couple of points. I can't imagine this process stopping. I think I'll just keep filming as long as people are happy to talk and the library's happy to listen. Part of my proposal was to make little stories out of this footage. The themes are easy to find. They reveal themselves about family and friends, about the suburbs and the city, about what music does to musicians, what a mystery it is, and how relentless is its grip. And it's about legacy as well. So what you've just seen is a start, but there'll be more to come. And now we just have some last words.
So that's the beauty of music, isn't it? You never know what's going to happen. You never know what's around the corner. And I'm very lucky that I'm able to juggle my life. I don't have any children. You know, I'm not a single mum that has to really struggle to, not struggle, but I don't have commitments. I've just got Donald the cat, which is a bit of a commitment. I have a partner, but you know, it's good. And I've got work, which sure, I work 4 days a week, and I've got a mortgage, and I've got all the usual things that you have when you grow up. You don't have to have them, but somehow I've ended up with them, and sometimes I wonder why. But yeah, I can still do it. Thank goodness.
If I go through the list, we'll be here for another hour, but you know, from Chrissy Amphlett to Spencer Jones, Brian Hooper, Tony Polar, Ian Ryland, Janine Hall, Conway Savage, Morris Frawley, Shane Walsh, the list goes on and on and on of my people I work with over my life who've died. And I've often actually, I'm pretty lonely because of this.
You know, I don't want my songs to die when I do. I really don't want them to die when I do. And that's a vanity, I suppose. But, you know, you like to say they're sort of like, they're the best part of me, and I'd hate to see them, you know. I have been an amazing survivor in the music industry without a hit record. You understand? I have not had a hit record. But at the end of the day, that kid, you know, from Mackay, the songs are really all that matters.
There you go. Thank you very much.